So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks everyone for tuning in. This is the Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access, and my name is Jaron McCullum, for those that aren't familiar. I'd just like to remind everyone that this is a public meeting and it is being recorded. We do have a meeting agenda on the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin's events calendar. It was also, well, I was going to say it was linked in the agenda, but that's a circle there. So just in an effort to maintain audio quality, if you could just be sure to mute yourself when you're not speaking, that'd be much appreciated. And any members of the public, we will have a public comment portion towards the end of the meeting, should you wish to speak. I'm going to now do roll call. So if you could just say here or let me know that you're present when I call your name, that'd be great. Brittany Byer.
Present.
Marta Beckdahl.
I'm here.
Tom Boron. Chad Young.
Here.
Jean Pauck.
Present.
Celeste Flynn.
Here.
Rachel Shemlin.
Here.
Brett Shepner.
Here.
Jose Martinez.
Here.
Chris Meyer. Chet Strebe.
Here.
Chris Herjong. Emily Dittmar.
Here.
Jennifer Schilling. Andy Faust.
Here.
Matthew Gabriels. Biko Baker. Lori Collins.
Present.
Gail Hike.
Present.
Shannon Clark. Sal Carranza.
Here.
State Representative Beth Myers. State Representative Jeffrey Mursaw. State Senator Howard Markline. And State Senator Brad Pfaff. Some people might have joined during that, so I'm going to run through one more time of the people that I didn't hear anything from. Tom Boron.
Yeah, present.
Thank you, Tom. Chris Meyer. Chris Herjong. Jennifer Schilling.
Here.
Thank you. Matthew Gabriels. Biko Baker. I believe I just saw Biko join. Shannon
Here.
Clark. Oh, thank you. Shannon Clark. State Representative Beth Myers. Rep Mursaw. Senator Markline. And Senator Pfaff. Did I miss anyone? If you could just speak up now. All right, thank you. I will turn it over to you, Brittany.
Great, thank you, Jaron. Thank you everyone for making some time this afternoon for broadband, such an important topic. As we're moving into the second year of the work, I really thank you for all of your time. It really looks like a different playing field, and we're going to be taking this arc of time to really investigate that. Today, we have a special guest. Chair Valk is going to be able to speak with us, which I really appreciate. And we're going to do some the regular stuff that we have to do, open records training, and then we're going to get into the meat of the discussion. So thank you so much for again, taking the time to do this, but Chair Valk, I want to hand it over to you. And thank you for being here.
Thanks, Brittany, and thank you for your leadership. As you said, we're entering into the next year of the task force, the work. And so I want to thank all the task force members for the time and the energy and the dedication and the ideas and the energy that you bring to this. Because while we have made all sorts of fantastic progress, we know that there is still a lot of work to do. And in order to reach the proverbial finish line, we're gonna have to be continuing to work together and continuing to be open to collaboration and innovation, because what you're going to start hearing more from the PSC and from me in particular is that we're really going to hone in on the 3 A's. So we're going to be continuing to look at access, but we also have to really dig in and lean in to affordability and adoption. So those 3 A's, you can't have one without the other. And we know that infrastructure is still a really important part of solving the digital divide in Wisconsin. We know that we have still nearly 700,000 people in the state of Wisconsin that don't have broadband access, but we also know that we have about 650,000 friends and neighbors who can't afford it. So it's not enough to just focus on the actual infrastructure. We also have to be tuned in to the affordability question. And then, of course, there's adoption. So it's not enough to just have the infrastructure and be able to afford it. We need to ensure that people understand how to use it and how to use it effectively, because everybody on this call knows that you have to be proficient in digital literacy skills in order to participate in everyday life. That's the state of the world that we live in. And so I really, really want to thank you for the time and the effort that you put to this, because it's going to take all sorts of creative solutions to ensure that we make progress on all 3 of those fronts. And then I would just, reiterate that we at the Public Service Commission are here as a partner and as a resource. We know, and we've heard a lot over the last 18 months in particular about the need for technical assistance at the local level. And so we are going to be taking some time to look at what types of efforts make sense. How can we better serve as almost a matchmaker to help connect communities and local governments with the technical assistance they need, especially with the influx of federal dollars. Again, and I've said this from the beginning, it's not enough to just have dollars available. We have to be sure that we continue to be really good stewards of those dollars, that we are using those dollars in a targeted way that will bring about meaningful progress. And I know I've had conversations with some of you, and I know that you share that vision. And in particular, I want to give a shout out to Celeste Flynn. Celeste and I have had a couple of conversations, and it became very apparent to me upon our first meeting that Celeste is all in and she is committed to helping solve the problem, especially as it relates to Milwaukee, which you all know is near and dear to my heart because I'm a Milwaukee native and I've struggled with broadband connectivity here in my house in Milwaukee. So it's not just an outstate issue. It's not rural versus urban. This is making sure that our Wisconsin residents have the infrastructure, the affordable infrastructure, and the access to adoption tools that they need to be able to live and work wherever they decide that they're going to live in this great state. So thank you all again. I know everybody has a lot going on, but your continued dedication, and this is, I think it's maybe the 3rd task force meeting that I've had the privilege to sit in on. And I see the repeat the repeat faces. And I know that it takes a lot of time and effort, but I really, truly appreciate it. Because again, we're not going to get to that finish line unless we all continue to work on this. So thank you for your time, and thanks for having me. And I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Brittany.
Thank you, Chair Vok. So much of what you said is what we're going to be working on today as well. So it's such a beautiful lead in. Jaren, I want to hand it back to you. And I believe we're doing open records training, correct?
Yes, Brittany. I will just turn it right over to Cynthia Smith, who is a Chief Legal Counsel at the Commission. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Again, I too want to underscore Chair Spock. Thanks for your service and participation in the very important work of this task force. In light of its importance and this task force being a subunit of government, this task force, as many of you know from your prior service, is subject to the public records law and the open meetings law. The presumption then is that your work that is embodied in the records that are produced by this task force should be open and available to the public. And so I'm here to provide a review. I know I gave a training when this group first formed. This is again just by way of review. I also have some, as we've learned working with the task force, I've identified an issue that we need to continue to work on to make this work as seamless as possible, and but also respecting the public records law, but also not having that be an impediment to the important work that you do. So with that, again, I welcome any questions via chat. Also, I will give my contact information at the end. I remain available to the task force members to address any questions you might have or public records. So we're going to start again with a brief review of what is a public record and maybe what isn't a record. What does a request look like? What do I need you folks to do when and if we get a request for records of this task force? Some helpful tips to help you and again, to make your compliance with the public records law as easy as possible. And then again, where to go with help and welcome questions. So again, it's oftentimes easier to say what isn't a public record than what is a public record. But basically anything paper or electronic with information about the work you are doing on behalf of this task force is likely to be construed as a record, subject to some exceptions that I'll talk about. So that could include memorandum, reports, PowerPoints, minutes, agenda, and the dreaded emails. That is always the biggest burden, not only of task force members, but as commission staff as well, when the commission gets public records requests. So I'll try to provide some helpful hints. Text messages are also another vehicle of that can be public records if you're talking about public work. Videos, voicemails, and even chats on these forums such as Zoom or Teams or other similar services. The type of device doesn't matter. You don't have to be just working from your desktop that is dedicated to your work versus a personal, your cell phone, somebody else's cell phone that you need to use to conduct business. It really is the nature and the content of the communication that is going to govern whether or not it is a public records. What is not a public record? Duplicate copies. Like many of you, sometimes I just need a paper copy of something, and I know that it's on the commission's website, such as an agenda, but for my own purposes, I like to have a printed copy. So duplicate copies of those things where the commission maintains the official record, such as open meeting agenda, open meeting notices, etc. The one caution I will say is that while we may have a duplicate of, say, a meeting agenda on our records, emails are a separate record in and of themselves. So while the attachment may not be a record, it is part of an overall record, which is that email. The other large exception are personal notes, where those notes are just used to refresh your own memory and not shared with others. So again, if you're like me and you take notes as you're going through a meeting just to remind yourself, those are not subject to the public records law. However, maybe a colleague missed a meeting and I want to share my notes, or that person says, hey, what happened at that meeting? And I go ahead and I share those notes to provide information to a colleague who may have missed the meeting or for some other purpose. Once you share those notes, those likely become public records. So be mindful of that. The trickiest exception, and this is where I know we came across this in working on the final report, are drafts or working papers. A draft of an earlier version is not in and of itself a record. The challenge becomes that if you're like me, when you are editing a document, I'm not only maybe modifying a sentence, a lot of times I'm dropping a comment in the comment box saying, hey, what do you think about this? Or shouldn't we talk about that? Those type of substantive comments that often find their way embedded in a draft really create some question then as to whether the whole document is a draft or isn't a draft. So we need to be careful with drafts, but I also recognize that there is an importance of having the ability to work collaboratively on a document. So we're working with our IT folks, and when we get to the part of drafting, we hope to have a better solution for you in terms of a SharePoint or other options where those versions can be saved, and we have that record. The other thing we want to try to then also avoid by finding maybe a new platform is the sharing of links and sharing of documents via email, because I send an email with a markup of a draft on February 1st, then on February 3rd, another email gets circulated and another draft is attached. If someone wants a copy of my February 1 record and the version that we were all working from on February 1 is now different than February 3rd and there isn't a copy retained, I'm going to have a challenge there. So we're going to try to come up with a better solution for everybody where there's a space where you can work, we can save those changes and not cause, some of the challenges that working in a digital format can when you're trying to work collaboratively. So more to come on that, but I do want to highlight, I know that has been a challenge and we'll work with you on that. What is a public records request? Again, it simply is, whether it's in writing or via an email or a telephone call verbally, a request for documents. There's no magic words. They don't have to cite the statute. They just need to make the ask for records. Now, those requests have to be reasonably specific, and they have to have some parameters around it so that when we're responding, we're not, unduly burdened of trying to figure out what it is the requester actually wants. So sometimes those can get clarified. There sometimes is a confusion between, well, what's really a public records request and what is really just a question? Because sometimes we may get a request that really says, how many people in the state don't have broadband access? Well, we can answer that with a question, or yes, maybe we have a map or a record that also shares that. So there can be some gray areas there, and maybe we're not sure if it's a request or an inquiry. And if you have something like that, please reach out to Alyssa or Jaren or myself, and we can help you navigate that. The request can be made to you as task force members. It can also be made to the commission or any commission staff regarding this. So if you do get a public records request, I'll talk through what your obligations are. The first is to retain records. So if you are communicating via text, those should be on a platform where those texts are maintained, not in a platform like WhatsApp or something like that, where they are not retained. So if you are communicating that way, be sure you are using a platform in a manner that those documents and records can be saved. The retention period for the work of these records is creation plus 5 years. So we will need to maintain these even after your service on the task force. There will be a continuing obligation. And obviously, since the work has continued and it's a lot of the same people, we've continued to have those people retain it. But if someone's going to leave the task force, we can work with that individual to get their records from them so they're relieved of the burden of having to hold on to them for 5 years. If you do get a public records request or something you think may be a public records request, please notify Jaren or myself, and we will work with you to respond to that. If I get a request or someone else on the task force gets a request for records, and I think your members may have record, I will work with Jaren to reach out and say and provide you guidance. Okay, this is the request. Here is the time frame of the request, and work with you to do the search necessary to get the information. And then lastly, your last obligation is to certainly ask questions and take trainings like this and refreshers. Excuse me. So just some helpful tips. It's always very helpful, especially working digitally, to clearly label personal notes and working drafts, as well as to the extent that there may be some confidential information. As I'm going and responding to a request and I've gathered information, it's important for me to know what I've got. And so you all clearly labeling various things so I can say, oh, I see that this was a draft. They gave it to me to review because I will ultimately be the person who decides, what is a record and what needs to be. A lot of times people aren't comfortable and they shouldn't be. They just give me everything and then I sort through and figure out kind of what is and is not responsive. So you labeling them makes that really helpful. So I know, like I take electronic notes, and if someone were looking at it, they may not know that those were just my personal notes and I didn't share them with anybody. I know many of you have important jobs outside of this very important work you're doing. So it's really important to maybe create your own electronic space or even physical space if you are a paper record type person, to separate those documents from your personal life, your other work life, so that if we get a request, there's a spot we know to go to look for that information. Again, not trying to impede the efficiency or the work of the task force, but I really do advise trying to minimize the number of platforms and devices in which you do your work on behalf of the task force. If you're using 3 cell phones and 4 different email accounts to do or communicate business relating to the task force, we're going to have to go and check every single one of those places for information potentially responsive to a request. So again, using kind of one email, kind of agreeing ahead of time, all right, we're going to communicate not via text, we're going to communicate via email. So minimizing texting, because texting, there are very good free or programs in which to extract text. You oftentimes have to, and people maybe are more savvy than I am, but you have to then forward it so it gets saved into some other platform or off your phone. So I just find texting is just messy, and it's best to communicate in other platforms that are a lot easier to save. And then labeling your work, just in case it gets mixed up with your other business, broadband, governor's task force or keywords, sort of making it a good habit to putting those keywords either in the ray line or somewhere in the email, such that if you have to go back and search for that, you can type in a keyword, governor, governors, or whatever it may be, and being consistent with that. That's a really good habit. And then lastly, where to go to help. Here is my contact information. I'm available at any time to help you navigate your obligations under the public records law or open meetings law. So please do not hesitate to reach out. Any questions? Stop sharing so I can see if there's anything in the chat.
This is Sal Carranza. Thank you for the reminder. I took the training last year as member of the task force, and I have done it in other governmental task forces as well. One question that is always have in my mind, on occasion, community organizations that we connect with know that we are on the task force, for example, and might ask us, hey, what has happened? What have been the discussions? Two things. One, are we free to give a general information, or should we keep it confidential in our task force? And second, if we can share, what has been, in general, for example, yeah, we're working on trying to get accessibility and affordability and adoption. This is what we're doing. Is that a public record when we communicate to these, community organizations? So yeah.
Great. Those are both really great questions. On the first questions, I really defer to, from a public record standpoint, obviously the presumption is we like to have public access, but I also appreciate that sometimes you need to work and develop something and not let things get too far out until you really have your collective thoughts. So I really kind of leave it to the task force to really amongst themselves decide, hey, let's wait until we're a little further along, maybe before we share this. So I just would defer to those members and your leadership on the task force. I think the presumption, unless, I would make it a practice to make sure you're clear if you do not want something to be shared. Again, you are doing things in open meetings, so very much of your work is going to be public, as is much of the work of the subcommittees, because that is also. But I do recognize, just as the commission, there are times where we have to deal with confidential information, whether that may be proprietary for certain providers, and maybe you need to protect that proprietary information. We need to talk about closed sessions or maintaining the confidentiality. So that's a great question. With regard to your second question, to me, while say a friend asks for information about work of the commission, I am, when I'm providing that, I am providing that information because of my position. And so I would consider that to be a public record. And it oftentimes too, it's always good to let people know if you're communicating, saying, hey, we're subject to the public records law. I just want you to know that if we are going to communicate, that I may be required to produce that information should we get a request. So again, I think being transparent both in the work that we do, but also letting people know that if they want to engage with us, that information we may have to share. I hope that answers your questions. Any other questions?
This is Shannon Clark. Just a question on orders of business, for example, and my requirement for retention. I'll give you a couple examples. How to join the meeting invite. These are things I do not respond to. Jaron sends them out. Maybe it's, here's a homework assignment. You can find it at this link. That record already exists, obviously, in the hands of leadership. It was sent from them to me. Is there a requirement for me to keep retention of, calendar invites and things of that nature?
Again, another really good question. While our email, and it sounds ridiculous, but it's really two separate records when you start looking at the different metadata. So while I have a record of what Jaron may send out to you, that from your device and you're receiving it, technically that is also a record. So you should be retaining those communications. You raise, though, a good point, again, and it's a finer point, but there is generally an exception of things that aren't considered records. those things that are sort of automatically generated or things that get pushed off. So, when maybe a calendar invite gets accepted and you get that notification that a calendar invite's been accepted, those kinds of automatic type things, those would likely not be considered a public record. Any other questions? Well, great. I really do appreciate, again, your service in the important work you're doing, and also your willingness to continue to become experts here in the public records law, and welcome the opportunity, should you have further questions, to come back at a later date. So thank you very much, and I'll let you get back to your work.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. I was just listening in myself and reflecting on how more mature my understanding of this nuanced area has become because of just participating at this level for now a year plus. So we're asking more intricate questions because we're deeper inside of it. So I thank you for being our guide inside of this. So we're going to take the remainder of our time today to really delve into the material. I wanted to take just a moment and bring us all to the same place. We're talking about the active network building and community alignment portion of the reports. So you had your pieces of homework. We're going to try to, of course, make it easy for you to do on your own, and because we understand that your time is really valuable. And it's really important to reflect on the work that we have done in the past to move forward. So this came as a subcommittee of the work that we did in that first round. From the report, it says that subcommittee was investigating ways Wisconsin can support the significant number of local communities seeking to expand broadband access, affordability, and adoption, and at time lacking the human, financial, or technical resources needed to pursue a project or plan. And I really believe that encompasses so many different communities in the state of Wisconsin. Chair Vox personal experience actually mirrors one of my own experiences with internet access and where I previously lived, which was in an urban center, and I was struggling with connectivity issues almost the same way as some people are struggling in rural communities. So there are some real interesting alignment issues that we're all experiencing inside of this work. And let me try to get this to move. There we go. And I also want to just reflect on 1 second, because when we were making the recommendations, we asked ourselves to continue to press on the questions in these ways. We wanted to make sure that these recommendations were future-proof. We talk about this very often. What does future-proof mean? I think the conversation has really matured around this topic, especially since a lot of the federal movements with the infrastructure bill, with the, just understanding that technology is going to rise even further as a necessity in our lives. So we need to be thinking really strategic and long-term. And we want to make sure that our recommendations are equitable, and how do they contribute to an equitable solution. So, to Chair Vox's assertion, yes, we're working on access, but we're working on affordability and adoptability at the same time, because those are all on the table as the pieces and elements that we're trying to solve. And then I went back to the governor's announcement about the task force on broadband. And we're really here to bring research and recommendations that can lead to connectivity for every person in Wisconsin, every person, every business, as much as we can get to. And, you know, we've all had the conversations last year about how do we get to everyone, right? So those far flung places, we're going to have a couple of different ways to get to them, but we want to make sure that there's options reaching every single person. And then the adoption piece of it then becomes really important. And so what do we really mean by active network building? So the relationships are layered and tiered, and forgive me because I played around with PowerPoint to get something that would actually work the way that I've actually put together this flow chart for myself so it would make sense. But this one made as much sense as I can. So they're concentric, they're interrelational, and every single layer inside of this has a little bit of the piece of the puzzle. This is only thinking about one kind of tier. This is kind of like the planning tier, right? So this is about those people who are trying to do initiatives on the ground or get resources to certain areas. And it's not necessarily the private sector, but this is how I see it as kind of working out. Starting at the top layer, of course, the state agencies. The broadband office is at the PSC, but there are a number of other state agencies that are working on broadband to some degree or very deep degrees. And how do we make sure that we understand those resources and get them all the way down to the local area? On the regional layer, there are regional planning commissions, there are regional economic development organizations, there are CISAs, there are regional library coalitions. How are all of those regional players working together to put together their strategies for the people that they serve? And there are more, right? There are more regional pieces to the puzzle. Regional hospital groups, they're all over the place. And how do we align all of these different resources together? And today we're going to be really looking at the local level. And so my personal experience in Wisconsin is certainly at the rural level, but there are things that happen in urban centers at the neighborhood level, at the community level, that have some similarities. So there's economic development that are at the table, chambers and local businesses who really know the importance of internet connectivity, municipalities participating. Sometimes it's an actual commission from a county or a local community. Sometimes it comes from the economic development side. Sometimes it's in the chamber. The providers are at the table at the local level as well, because that's where the work is happening. Sometimes it's smaller local providers that have intimate relationships and know the people because they live in the communities. And sometimes it's a national provider who has great tools because they have a nationwide presence. And how do we work with both of those different pieces of the puzzle? And there's more layers inside of that. There's hospital groups, as I said, school districts, nonprofit organizations. So there's a lot of different people who could be at the table. And of course, I like to always ask the question, who's missing? And that's going to be a little bit of what we're going to be doing in the exercises in a little bit. So reflecting back onto the report, there was a part that said, we know that local communities need knowledge building, they need the aligning of the collaborators, they need assistance in funding first projects, and matching technical assistance programs to the needs of the community. So that is something that was already known as an issue. And then WEDC worked with the PSC to do the broadband pilot in the fall, winter of 2020. This was the map that the PSC showed during the last presentation. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to give you a little bit more information about the applications. We're trying to get that information for you all, but I think all of us get the understanding that if you look at the communities that applied, sometimes it was a community leader, sometimes it was a nonprofit organization, all different stripes applied for this assistance. And they were all at different layers of readiness. But today we're going to really be thinking about what local communities really need. So just to make sure that everyone understands, we're focusing only on the local communities today, but we're going to be talking about the other layers that are inside of this during the later meetings and probably breakout sessions in other places. And so I firmly agree that the unusual players have not been asked to the table. So I really challenge everyone to think about, we all say the same things, they have to be there. There's like, you have to have X, Y, and Z players, but who in your experience has been a really pinnacle piece to solving the puzzle, who could really be a game changer in other places? And, it's about those interdependent relationships. And so what you might find from today's discussion are items that we need to remember and explore when maybe we're talking about state agency resources, or thinking about regional larger impact that can be done at that regional level. So I just wanted to make sure everyone kind of thought through that layering before we got into the work that Kristen's going to work with us at this point. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Kristen. I hope everyone did their homework. We didn't have that much reading, right? So it's a fairly short piece of the whole entire report, but I'm really interested in seeing what we're going to be talking about further.
Thank you, Brittany. And we did have 13 responses on the survey for homework, and they were all A-level responses. So thank you for doing your homework and being thoughtful about it. Hopefully that's going to help us prepare to have a good discussion today and really dig in as soon as we get into small groups. So before we get started, let me just tell you a little bit about what we can expect today. We're going to be using Google Slides as our discussion platform. And in a few minutes, Jaren is going to send us all into small group breakout rooms that will be facilitated by a member of the Public Service Commission staff. They will do any sort of writing or they can do the writing that we might want to do on the slides. You're free to write on your own group slides as you see them in a second. We have 3 questions today. They're identical to the ones that you saw in the homework, and I'll get some feedback at the end of the day today. If you like the format where you get the question ahead of time, you've got a little bit of homework to reflect on it, and then you bring that kind of thought into our discussions when we're together as a group. Let me know. If there's another way that you see this might work better for future meetings, let me know that at the end of the day today too. So connecting what we're about to do with public records, the document that you filled out in the survey is downloaded and aggregated into a single document that I will be passing on to the Public Service Commission for their records and to make sure that we're in compliance with all of the laws. The slides we're going to use today are a temporary workspace, and they're clearly labeled as such when you see the link to the slide. Those, after a couple of hours after our meetings, will also be downloaded and preserved and available for public view. When you log onto the slides, you will most likely be anonymous unless you're logged into a Google account. I am anonymous. When I go on it, I think we all are assigned random names from Google from it. So I'm going to put the link in the chat box right now to the Google Slides. Our first question for discussion today is going to be the first question that you had in your homework. What is a sign of good local readiness for a broadband project? And so we've posed that. You've answered it already. I'm going to screen share for a moment and show you how we will be discussing that. All right, you should be seeing an introductory slide, Governor's Task Force on Broadband. Jaren's nodding his head yes, so I think we're all there. When you click on that link, you should be able to have access to this document. Anybody with the link can log into it, provided your workplace or the network you have set up allows you to use Google Documents. If you do not have access to that, you can voice your contributions to your group's discussion. The way this will work is all groups, when you're assigned a group and you go into your discussion room, You'll notice that there'll be a title Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4. Each group will have its own set of slides to mark up and write on. I'm going to ask you, I think everybody in this group is really great at homework. Don't work ahead, only work on the slide that we're currently discussing. So group 1 would see if they logged on, all of the members will see 3 slides. They're first only going to work on the first question. After that first question has been discussed for 5 or 6 minutes, we're going to come back to an entire group of all of us as the task force to debrief on that before we move on to question number 2. What are the components of a well-planned broadband project? We'll discuss that for 5 or 6 minutes, come back to our individual groups, and then our final question will be, who is part of a well-planned project? Now you'll notice that each one of the groups has their own set of slides. So your first task as a group, when you go into your discussion room, is to make sure you're using the slides that are connected to your group's discussion. No big deal if you're not, but hopefully we'll get everybody on their slides. And Jaren, I'm going to ask you, I think we planned on 4 or 5 groups, but I was doing the math in my head and I wasn't sure.
I've got it configured for 4 right now, so I think we're
perfect.
Well synced up.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jaren. So that's how we're going to work the slides or the discussion today. I use this platform rather than some of the others because it's relatively easy and intuitive to use, and we do have the ability to get as many people on it as we can. Now, one of the features of using Google Slides is that even though you are discussing, perhaps you're in group number 2, you can move back and forth, and while you can't hear what's happening in group 1, you can certainly see what's happening in group 1. So in this way, we can kind of have our own discussions informed by what others might be discussing. So that is where we're headed next. I'm going to stop my screen share for a moment. One of the things I promised in the homework that was assigned is that I do a quick summary, a 10,000-foot overview of what everyone answered in the survey that comprised our homework. So for this very first question, what is a sign of good local readiness for a broadband project without reading word for word everything that was written? Some of the common themes were that communities had identified underserved areas, whether those areas matched up with what had been mapped as a broadband served area or not served. Second, there was a strong theme of budgeting and resources, budgeting in terms of money, but also resources in terms of time and talent had been allocated. But one of the third strong themes that came through was that local leaders were on board, and local leadership was talked about in a number of different ways, but the strongest themes of local leadership were that particular individuals within a community that were leading efforts officially or unofficially as elected leaders or perhaps agency heads were on board, but then also institutions, so the anchor institutions within a community were on board. Another common theme, not as often, but really prominent when it did come up, was pre-registration for communities who are approaching true readiness for broadband. And then one that almost everyone mentioned was community involvement. So those are some of the common themes. Within that, there were a lot of elements that were great points that did not make the top 5 list. So as we send you into this first question, what is a sign of good local readiness or a good indication of local readiness for a broadband project? Have those things in mind and let's see if we can flesh them out. So with that, Jaren, I think we're ready. Well, first of all, any questions before we send you into small groups?
I broke a little bit there. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Can you hear me okay? I broke up there just a second. Okay, so I am going to move folks to their breakout rooms. With this number, it is a bit challenging, so I'm going to send kind of the first wave, and then I might have a few people that I wasn't quite sure if they would like to join, or members of the public, and I can kind of direct traffic from there. So, and if you could just remember your group number, and then that'll make it more seamless next time when we come back and then go back into the breakout room. So I'm going to open those rooms, and you should get, the good majority of you should get an invite to join a breakout room. And so like I said, a couple of people didn't get that invite, and I may just have to do some traffic directing, just depending on where folks wanted to go. I didn't want to stick someone where they didn't want to go. So let's just run down this list. Is anyone from the PSC that I didn't assign, did they want to join a particular breakout room, or did they want to do their own thing?
I'll join one, Jaren, but I don't have one in particular.
Okay, I will go ahead and move you then. Thank you, Christy.
Same for me, Jaren. This is Laura.
Okay. Any members of the public, would they like to join a particular breakout room? If you would, just let me know.
I don't mind, Jaren, which one?
Okay.
Yeah, I could go wherever too. I think I'm still in no man's land. I don't think I've actually been invited yet. So
Okay. I've still got a couple other people. Kristen, would you? I think you may have the capability to join whatever room you would like. I don't know if you want to pop in and out, but I'll leave that
I
up
think
to
I'm
you.
gonna float. Yeah, if that's all
Okay.
right.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and sometimes if it looks like there's a lot of writing, then I stay out of a room or I just stay in this space. But thanks, this seems to be working well.
Mm-hmm.
Jaren, this is Jennifer Schilling from Dairyland on the committee.
Oh.
I don't see if I have been assigned a group. Oh, there you go. Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
sorry, the name was throwing me off. Sorry about that. I
Okay.
wasn't quite sure what DPC was, but now,
Oh,
now
yeah,
it makes
Dairyland.
sense.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Jaren, looks like Dr. Baker's still with us here too.
Really, I don't actually see. He's not showing up on my list. That's curious.
He just disappeared off. my screen.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, good. Hopefully he's in a room now.
You can put me.
Welcome back, everyone. If you're like me, chances are you got booted back to the main room, like right in the middle of this sentence that was like the key to solving the whole problem. I feel like there's always that bit of wisdom that always gets interrupted when we come back, but such are the limits of technology. So before we move on to our next question, let's just debrief and talk about what your groups talked about. Would we like to go? Let's see here. Let's call on people. Group 4, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you discussed? And if you had the chance to look at what other people said, and you might not have, you might have been way too busy. If you see any commonalities or you expect to hear any commonalities.
I didn't look at what the other groups were discussing, but what we talked about was basically the communities needing to recognize first that it's an issue, and being able to work with public bodies to try and approach it, whether that's to quantify it, whether that's infrastructure, whether that's access, affordability. A piece of that is asking the right questions, seeking examples, really just starting down that path in the right way to identify the scope of the issue or the problem, and then working, collaboratively through government agencies, public-private partnerships, and then how that bridges over to the ISPs.
Excellent. Thank you, Jennifer. And Jennifer, which group would you like to call on next? 1, 2, or 3?
2, please.
I was the note taker for our group, so I'll just go over what we talked about, but anybody else in the group, please just chime in because these were all of your ideas here. So we talked about that it's important to have community involvement and making sure that everyone is represented, that there's public and private partnerships involved in trying to move these initiatives forward, and that adoption comes when everyone is involved in these discussions, that there's built-in outreach and training. And then from a provider's perspective, in terms of markets for fiber overbuilding, how many customers are willing to sign up, because it makes the market more attractive when there's more interest from local communities. Accurate mapping is also very important, looking at middle mile data for readiness in terms of census tracts and underserved areas. What's the affordability so that it's sustainable to maintain active members and participation and adoption. The people must know how to use the technology properly and that there's training incorporated. And this is where we got cut off. So this was the last thought, but that leadership has the ability to move the project forward. And then if anybody else in group 2 wanted to add to any of the notes I have here.
Great job, Laura.
All right. What do we have left? 1 and 3?
1 and 3.
Okay, let's do 3.
All right, I took notes for group 3 and I'll put it out here right up top. Would anybody from group 3 like to share what we talked about? And I'm happy to if not, but if we have a volunteer.
Christy, I'd be happy to share, and then anyone in the group can jump in if I'm missing something or not stating it correctly.
Thank you. Thanks,
Sure.
Rachel.
So the group talked about the importance of having identified needs and knowing what those needs are in order to be a readiness, an indicator of readiness for a project. The importance of resolutions and through the county resolutions and other permitting that would be necessary to have the project move forward. On the front end, also making sure that those permitting requirements are not barriers. So talking through some of the specifics and partnerships that can happen to make the project successful early on between the provider and the other entities, as well as making sure that the institutional structures and resources are in place. So understanding that there's been performance studies or other readiness work, that would be an indicator of readiness. And if they're still looking for supports in those resources, then perhaps they're not quite ready for the project, but they're getting close. We also talked about the importance of confirming eligibility and using the different mapping tools to prepare a project. And then another one that we didn't quite get to is being able to maybe show success from previous projects. So those are some of the ideas in the group. And did anyone else want to add or elaborate on one of those?
And just to elaborate on the part about resources, many communities do not have the resources to do that work that needs to be done to find out what are the needs, how to go about developing the project, to get to the point when they have a plan. And so we have to find a way to provide support to those communities by partnering with other organizations that might have those skills and resources to help these local communities, which are the ones that indeed need the most support. These are the communities that we haven't been able to reach out to. These are the communities that do not have at this point access to this broadband. So those are the communities we now need to find other organizations, institutions that can provide that resources and that support to those local communities so that they get to the point where they are ready to actually implement what needs to be implemented. But of course, the commitment of these local communities, like you mentioned at the beginning, and many in the group mentioned, to be willing to find a way to remove barriers so that all of these things that need to happen about permits and things like that are as easy as possible, so that we don't have to spend time trying to get those things before we can actually implement what we need to do to provide this access to those communities. So that's just a little addition to what you.
Readiness and barriers, two sides of the same coin often. That's what's occurring to me as I'm listening to everyone share their experiences and their understanding of this. So I think we still have group 1 to go? Group 1.
I was the note taker, but if I could copy through group 3 and invite a group 1 task force member to report out if they're able and willing. I'll jump in. And maybe I don't want to repeat too much that others have said, but knowing the unserved areas, everyone at the table from the beginning, I think maybe something that I heard from others is an early connection between provider and providers in the community. Even maybe communities should be sort of ready and able to interview or provide a questionnaire to providers about their needs and what the project would be. And then we talked about there's like a technical, a fiscal, and a legal readiness that a community might need to have some capacity in all 3 of those areas as they prepare for a project and working within provider.
Excellent. Those are 3 great categories: technical, fiscal, and legal. When you were all filling out your slides, I was lurking and watching the conversations happen. And there are a lot of commonalities here that I'm sure you noticed. The need for data and in order to identify underserved areas and served areas, to identify needs. The word studies came up a couple of times, local studies that have been completed. Local policy in the form of resolution permitting is another strong theme that I see in the slides, and you might see as well. Institutional structures to support the work that is being done. And that is sometimes that facilitates the work. Oftentimes when we're lacking the institutional structures locally, that of course is a barrier to work, even starting, much less being completed. And then recognizing an issue, so a degree of public awareness that this is an issue and that this is a critical issue to a community. And then another theme was collaboration within the community, and then collaboration with external organizations and statewide agencies as well. So just some of the things that I hear when I'm listening to everybody speak, and there's more that could be uncovered if we weren't doing this live, that I'm sure will come through in our writing and our reports later on. So we are ready to go on to question number 2. And as promised, the 10,000-foot overview for question number 2. Question number 2, if you'll recall, are what are the components of a well-planned broadband project? And here your answers to the survey homework was really consistent with what Brittany mentioned earlier. She used the term critical piece or pinnacle piece. You identified oftentimes that the components of a well-planned project involved organizations and structures within a community. So that is all I'm going to offer on this right now. And I am going to send you into your groups with Jaren, and then we'll come back and talk in another 5 minutes.
All right, I'm going to open those rooms up, and you should have access to the same room again. And likewise before, if there's anyone who wants to be directed to a room that hasn't been, just let me know and I can do that.
Welcome back, everyone. That time always goes quickly, doesn't it? So let's start with our debrief again, and let's have group 1 go first this time.
Any takers from group 1? I'll just go again quick. We talked about data, all types of data, provider data. We emphasized that the address of the data and the actual location that the data comes from is really important, not just aggregating entire communities or counties, but providers really need to know where is this address or this person specifically that wants service or that has this low speed. Price points, anticipated take rates, what does the community really want as far as service? Letters of support, fiscal contributions, literal investments in the project from businesses, communities, homeowner associations, anchor institutions,
and then just that stakeholder engagement again.
Excellent. Excellent. And who would you like to call on next? Which group?
2.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's me again. I'll share out for our group. So we talked about having funding sources lined up for the project and availability of human resources component. I think that was just kind of describing like people involvement component in terms of materials and supplies, and specifically in regards to supply chain issues that have been an issue in the wake of the public health emergency. Looking at specifically in the Metro Milwaukee area, having convened a lot of stakeholders, putting together a plan for feasibility studies, specifically in terms of adoption. Contracting with relative entities, looking at data for gaps in Milwaukee, specifically in terms of adoption. The process is different for affordability versus adoption. Milwaukee is well wired in terms of infrastructure, but it comes down to the adoption piece. So therefore, if there's low adoption rates, then it's most likely a result of an affordability issue. So looking at current research to support a more robust plan. From a provider's perspective, what is the definition of a broadband project? Who's eligible? What are the underserved areas, or who are the underserved individuals? The scope of the project build, working with these different stakeholders to create a definition of what the scope of the project is from all these different perspectives. In terms of co-ops and nonprofits, tribal leadership and tribal organizations, there's a lot of federal dollars there to partner. And it's important to be working with regional economic development teams. And then looking at sustainability and scalability is also crucial. How to grow and be sustainable in the long run. And putting money where there is the best impact for future planning. Anybody else from group 2 wanted to add to anything? Did I leave anything out? Okay, I got a thumbs up from Gail. Okay, so I'll pass it to group 3 again.
Thanks, Laura. Anyone from group 3 want to jump in? All right, I don't think I'm hearing anyone, so I'll do a summary of this one. We talked about a well-planned project needs a clear timeline with detailed checkpoints or milestones. And it also needs demonstrated adequate resources to deliver on that timeline and on those checkpoints. That includes adequate materials, contractors lined up, and in today's day and age, Shannon mentioned contingency plans. Expertise on the project and well-defined roles, a clear understanding of the resources needed, clear data on, community need, potential sales, uptake, that type of data, defined project communication elements. So very well defined who's the point of contact and who's the lead for each type of question or issue that would come up in a project. The financials need to work. There needs to be sufficient capital. And I think Justin mentioned taking a land and expand approach. So taking a tiered strategic approach to where to start a project and which customers to bring on in phase 1 and then expand out to like a phase 2 and 3, if I'm capturing that correctly, Justin. And Shannon mentioned a similar approach, a strategic migrate to the edge planning. And then real estate, one thing that was mentioned as well that really needs to be lined up and can cause troubles if not. Anything from group 3 that I missed or didn't cover? Thanks. I'll pass it to 4.
That's me. Anyone from group 4 want to jump in? Okay, I'll summarize briefly. We talked about this primarily from the provider perspective. A lot of that's already been covered in discussion from the previous groups, but how you map out a project, what makes it desirable from a provider point of view, how you build a viable business case, how does it fit with your existing or expanding networks, and then how it's going to be sustainable, both from a technological point of view and also from a subscribership base. We did get cut off right at the end as we talked about. I think Brittany was about to make the point that how do communities take into account what that provider point of view and that provider need is. So if anyone wants to jump in, or Brittany, if you want to jump in and finish that point that we got cut off on, please do.
Thank you. Yeah, Jennifer and everyone, I was the person in both breakouts who was making the point and was cut off. And I think it was pretty much along the lines of that. In curiosity, trying to understand the provider's perspective and then flipping it to the community's perspective, and how sometimes they're not taking in account that perspective, and how do we help them put that into their planning process as early as possible.
Excellent, excellent. So again, what are some of the common themes that you all are seeing here? I kind of gave you some common themes before, but what are you seeing in this second question that is a thread? Nobody was expecting a sudden question.
Can you repeat yourself, Kristen? Because I think the data got jumbled. You got a little jumbled.
Sorry. What do you see as a common thread in this second? After listening to the other groups and looking at their slides, what are some of the common threads that you all see here?
I think that the resources is a common theme. I think a well-planned has to have the elements well-defined so that it can be followed appropriately. Like we mentioned in our group, the timelines, who's responsible at each stage, which stages are going to be moving forward. It's really well-defined plan has to have those elements present. Contingencies, all those things have to be part of the plan before you even start actually implemented the plan to make sure that everything is in place to be successful. So that's the common theme, I think. What are the elements that need to be there? You know, and I just mentioned those, and we have throughout mentioned them.
I agree. I agree. The idea of road mapping, the idea of checklists, the idea of these structures. Back before the internet, we would have all had a binder that we would have pulled off of a shelf and opened up, and there would have been a long list of things that need to be done. So I feel like when I'm watching this as an outsider who's not gone through this process of planning for broadband, I'm starting to see a structure. And I think maybe some of you are, probably all of you are too. So with that, let's send you into the third question: structures, organizations, checklists, contingency plans, data gathering, all happen because there are people behind that effort. When we asked the question in the homework, who is part of a well-planned project? The answers were pretty comprehensive when I looked at all of the elements that you pulled together: anchor institutions, economic development corporations, foundations, state agencies, specific local leaders, specific local elected or administrators. So let's go into groups for another 5 minutes and make a list of some of those people that we know are going to need to be at the table locally to help. They might not be from that local community. They might be coming into the local community to help, but who needs to be at that table in order to help some of these things occur?
Kristen, can I ask a question here before we go there? This is a hard question for me to really get my arms around, because who is part of a well-planned project? And I'm not sure. The well-planned indicates past tense. You know, who all came together in the planning, and then who's involved in carrying it out is maybe more of the project. Is there a bright spot here where you, and I don't know who wrote the question, but is it more about execution of a well-planned project, Or is it more about the planning? Or because if it's top to bottom, I think you would answer the question with everybody except those that shouldn't be. It's that's a little confusing for me in who is part of a well-planned project, because I think project in present tense, and I think of planning it, pretense or even past tense. So Brittany, I don't know what the intention is here. Because it's a completely different, in my view, a different group.
Well, I think in your idea of a group, please do put it forth. And I understand your perspective has a very local based, right? Like you're very tied to your locality. So you could also say, who do you wish was part of that group and you haven't seen them as part of the group yet?
Yeah,
Because
but at what point, your
Yeah.
initial slide had everything from the state agencies to the regional to the locals, and you'd want all of them involved in developing the plan. I'm likely not going to have them in the execution side.
Well, right. So I would say the slide that I shared, each layer actually has their own plan that is kind of running. Sometimes it's the process of a grant that has to have a process. And there's regional planning, there's local planning. And I think right now we're working on the local planning side. I think, does that help a little bit? I was trying to break down that there's all of these different layers, but right now we're talking about the local level.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I would expect that the city council might be involved in a municipality deciding to do a broadband project. Once that project plan is created, I would expect that they would be just watching from the sidelines at that point and probably not as actively engaged. They've laid out what they want. Now it's time for somebody else to carry that out. I mean, we'll get a lot of different answers here regardless, but it does seem like it's a question of who is part of a well-planned, a lot of people, who is part of the execution, smaller group.
So I see your point. I guess what we were trying to get at is more the execution side of things, right? So who are the doers? Who has to be at the table? Who are the people in a community who would open doors to make certain things possible? In local communities, you might be right that it's the municipality leaders themselves say, okay, yes, here's the resolution, now go. There still has to be a steering committee that's steering it forth. Who are part of those conversations? Who has to be brought into the conversation, at least to a certain degree, for a couple of meetings, has to be there, has to have their perspective weigh in order for to incorporate their perspective. Does that help? Or am I just making it more convoluted? I think perhaps we should just go into our groups and talk. And actually, because we have time, we can kind of chew on this a little bit more, if that's what it feels like.
I appreciate the clarifying question. It is really important. Maybe one of the ways that we can approach it is by identifying who are the different people in the room when we're talking about planning versus execution. Where's the overlap in that? Are there some people that would be involved in both, or is it a handoff in most situations? So maybe that's one way of understanding and thinking about the answer to this question. And I know that's not a perfect answer, or perfect clarification. Let's give it a swing. What do you guys say? Sharon, do you want to send us into the rooms?
Sure, I will open those up. And we'll join back in about 5 minutes.
Welcome back, everyone. All right. As is our tradition established today, we'll start by debriefing with the group that went last going first. So group 4, that will be you.
Okay. Would anyone like to jump in and summarize this? If not, I will. Okay. We talked about on the local planning side, who gets involved and who are the doers, and it was all the groups that we had talked about, you know, in the main group, the anchor institutions, the EDCs, the foundations, state agencies, and so on. Two of the things that I thought were important was the provider point of view of, yes, all those groups need to be involved and it needs to be in phases. So there can be a lot of involvement up front, but when you get to the actual physical execution of the project, the fewer involved, the better, because it just seems to muddy the waters. The other piece that I thought was particularly interesting was local planning takes a lot of curiosity and it has a lot of nuances. And if you ignore the nuances in a local project, you might miss some of the local players that need to be at the table. Anyone else like to add anything? Group 1, maybe.
That's me and our group. And we did a lot of listing city, towns, counties, local government, including maybe Department of Public Works, engaging with anchor tenants, including colleges, higher education, K-12, homeowners associations or lake owner association or lake associations, county, maybe the 911 system in the county, tribal leadership or broadband committees, NGOs like United Ways and Boys and Girls Clubs, obviously, or not obviously, state agencies in cases where they have offices or interest, and then middle mile and backhaul providers. So we just did sort of a bulleted list of everybody. Anyone want to add any that we missed on our notes or I missed? All right, can I pass it to number 3?
Anyone from 3 really eager to cover this one?
Christy, I'll take it because I feel like I muddied the water here. So I guess I have this kind of obligation, if nothing else.
That's fair.
I'm maybe going to take the slides, and if you have it in front of you, I'm going to maybe jump around a little bit. Trying to define my own question, kind of lean towards who would meet the previous question, the components of the plan. So maybe it's more execution focused, but we tried to tie it to the previous question. What are the components of a well-planned project? So this was who's going to carry out those components. We may have strayed from that a little bit. And then I'm going to flip it around and start from the bottom up, because one of the things that we found was the kind of put ourselves in the shoes of the person who's going to receive the service. What is it that they need? And it's a big group. You have to be sure you're going to meet the needs of whoever your service recipient is, using that term to maybe capture not only customers, but other places where data is important. So start with them, and when they define their need, who are they going to reach out to? And they're likely reaching out to policymakers, those people who might be able to build the network or implement it, and talk among their peers. So again, now we're going from, I'll use the word customer, up to them trying to solve their own need. They're probably going to talk to policymakers and people who can build out a network to meet their needs. Moving up from there, then you probably would find that group reaching out to elected officials, providers, contractors, chambers of commerce, and they were listed well in another slide, other community organizations. So it's kind of the reverse of what we're doing here, where we're taking it from a planning stages down to the subscriber, to turning around and taking it from the subscriber need. Who would they go to for help, and making it go the other way. And throughout all of that, we had one point that, you know, we really don't want to leave someone out in the planning stage, and they may very well be key in the implementation stage. For example, that customer, that subscriber that we talked about, that's who we're trying to satisfy. We don't necessarily just want to hear what they want now. We want to keep them in the implementation stage as well, so that we're sure that they're meeting their needs, and not only that, but they're expanding. So we talked about how that facilitates adoption. Somebody might have a defined need, but their neighbors may not have yet defined any need, and they need help with adoption. So kind of took a different approach to the way we talked about it. We kind of went top down. I kind of turned it around here and went bottom up, maybe just to add some clarification. Anybody else, comments?
I guess I'd just like to add, just listening to the conversation through the whole thing, I think what we kind of miss is if we're going to build out to all our customers, I think where they have to end up finding out is how much is this service going to cost those people? Because may build it, if you build it out and it costs $100, nobody's going to get it on the end of a road or something, or somebody that can't afford it. So I think it really, one of the first things that we need to look at is how much is that service going to cost in the community, so we know how many customers we're going to end up with.
Yeah, I certainly agree. And that was one of the things that we talked, that's why I think why we looked at the customer first there and said, you've really got to understand that subscriber, customer, service recipient, call them what you will. You've got to really understand that. And I think we kind of brought that up in the, what's a component, affordability. Yeah, I think we have to be careful that we don't just assume that it's going to be affordable, because there's a lot of areas where that assumption will get you in trouble.
I'm wondering if we could almost call this like, it's a holistic approach, a 360-degree approach, or maybe an iterative process where we're really, I forget who the organizational guru in the 90s was for business people that always said, begin with the end in mind. I'm thinking begin with the end in mind. Who is that end user? What do they need? How much can they afford? Those are very critical issues, very critical issues. Yeah. So thank you, Shannon, for that. Thank you very much. Yes. And thank you, Representative Mursaw. And who would you like to call in next, Shannon?
There's only one left, isn't there? Two.
Yeah,
you're
it's
right.
us.
I got that one,
Group
process of elimination. I knew I'd get that answer right.
Group two. Okay, I'll share for our group again. Yeah, we were kind of taking into consideration Shannon's comments, and people in our group had that same question too, as part of their homework. So we started from the provider perspective, and that the providers are already doing the project management and project planning. They've already executed hundreds of projects. They have the resources and the supplies, and they do the rollout. But to be truly successful, that you can't abandon these other parts. The community must continue to work with the providers to keep it affordable, working with chambers and economic development councils and corporations. There was some talk about healthcare and how that's huge, and getting information out there, and that people are able to stay home but remain independent. The provider has the expertise and the staff, but providers need information from different groups like IT departments, mapping, leadership to provide facilitation of bringing the local community together. And how do all of these pieces come together? So it's important to plan up front. How do we do affordability, adoption, profitability in the long run? It all ties together. How are we defining the project? And once the project is in place and it's been implemented, is there data on what keeps these projects profitable? This might be helpful information for the task force at the front and back end of these projects as part of the project plan. And if we could have a template for this information, that could be something that's helpful for the task force. And then Milena, you started to talk about something right at the end. I didn't get any of it. Do you want to add in?
Yes, I was just mentioning about the anchor institution that other group then ended up mentioning. So I think it's always important to remember that sometimes we want to reach the individual customer or individual users, but there are anchor institutions that can embrace them much easier than try to tackle one at a time. And every even little villages sometimes has a group that is a school related to, or senior groups, or even the library, those kind of main anchor institution, and of course the local clinic. Not necessarily the hospital, sometimes are more centralized, but even a local clinic with a group of nurses, are very good conduit for requesting, and a backup institution that are big enough to have their voice heard. So just throw it in there.
Thank you. Thank you. These are I've got about 1,000 questions that we could think of discussing next that weren't on our homework. And I don't think anyone wants to stay until 8 o'clock tonight. So let's hone it down to maybe just one question for the last 10 minutes of our conversation here today. We've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about components, we've talked about people, we've talked about, maybe alluded a little bit to the difference between needs at one stage of a process. Are we doing a planning project? Are we doing an execution project for broadband? How are the needs different? And who are the people at the table that would be different? Among the stuff that we discussed today, maybe going back to the idea of the components of a well-planned project, or the data that's needed, or the people that we would, or organizations we would bring back to the table. What is the low-hanging fruit here for most local communities? What are the things that you'll think would be easier for them in terms of groups they could bring to the table, or information that they might need that we've identified today? Or conversely, what are the things that might be trickier or out of reach? And let's just bat around some of those ideas, maybe for 10 minutes, the things on both ends of the spectrum, the easier things for them to accomplish, a local community to accomplish, and the more difficult or trickier things that they're going to need more support for among the items that we discussed today.
One of the trickier things that I've heard communities share is the design and engineering process required for a project. How to start with that, where to start, who to contact, and begin that process. They know they need to do a needs assessment. They know there's underserved and unserved areas in their community, but that's where they are. And then paying for that process also. That design and engineering process is very extensive and expensive.
Extensive and expensive are often project killers alone without complexity. What are some of the other things? Those are excellent points.
I've seen on the local level, one of the trickier items has been getting municipality buy-in. Maybe it's coming from the business sectors, or, the schools saying that they need broadband, but the very, very local elected officials don't feel like they have the resources to solve it, so that they just feel as if it's above what they can handle. So how figuring out the right insertion level of support, even at that level, could be beneficial.
I'm going to speak from personal experience on this one, and I think one of the trickier parts for us, and thank goodness we're not there any longer, is actually finding a provider that's willing to come into your area. Being in out in nowhere land, for them to come in and make money in an area where you have lack of population, nobody wants to come in to begin with, and when they're not in your area to start with, they have to come out of their home area to expand in your area, which looks like a better. It was a tough sell. So, but that was one of our trickier parts, I think, and that's where the grants and all that all help out immensely. Without those federal and state dollars, I don't think we'd be anywhere yet. So.
All great points. What are some others? Is there anything on here that's low hanging fruit? It might all be tricky. It might all be tricky.
It reminds me of the first year of work where we asked about the low hanging fruit question as well, and we got the same answer. So I think the low hanging fruit is a really tricky thing to approach, because the cost of addressing the issue, even in communities that have a build out, but there's adoption problems, then you're talking about purchasing computers and paying for a staff member for training them. And there's just cost and time involved at every turn at this point, and that's where people are tending to get caught up.
If you have very, very little low hanging fruit, then you need ladders and bucket trucks to get the job done. So maybe that's what we are working. That is undoubtedly what we are working towards, ladders and bucket trucks to get the job done. So that concludes our discussion for today. We still have about 6 minutes left on our time. So Brittany, I'll turn it over to you and to the rest of the meeting.
Great. So thank you everyone for participating. We have wanted to start with the local level, kind of from what Shannon was talking about. It is the bottom up. Sometimes you have to work from the top down. And so we're going to be taking the information that we gathered from all of you, thinking through what it's telling us our next steps. There's those other layers inside of the network. We'll be turning to certain ones when it's appropriate, so from the PSC team, you might have heard that the DOT has a permitting efficiency that's going to be emerging, and it's a little too early to talk about it. So we'll address things at the appropriate time, but we'll be reaching out to you. You'll get more homework. We'll figure out if we're having these we're working at a little bit of a truncated scheduling compared to the first year of the task force. So we're also going to be grappling with how and when we want to spill it into deeper discussions about certain pieces that we think are going to go into the report. So just, you've all been very good about responding. For the new task force members, I apologize if I haven't reached out to you. I'd love to talk to you all individually. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to try to reach out to you. That goes for all the task force members. If we haven't caught up, and you want to chat, then I'm certainly happy to meet one-on-one with everyone. But that's all for today. I'm really thankful that, everyone participated and gave some really good input, because it's going to give us ammunition when we go back and kind of look at everything. So I'll hand it back over to you, Jaren, for some of the last steps for the meeting.
Thanks, Brittany. So everyone should have future meeting dates. If you don't have the calendar invites, just let me know. Those upcoming dates are March 9th, April 13th, May 11th, and June 8th. Those are all from 1 to 3 p.m. We'll have an agenda coming for the upcoming March 9th meeting. As with similar other offers, just please feel free to reach out if there's any questions or confusion. I'll now go to the public comment portion. So if there's any public comment, members can go ahead and unmute and make a public comment. I just ask that it remain relatively brief and pertain to the subject of broadband access. Any public comments? I'll make a last call for public comments. Hearing none, I will also note that we do take public comments in a written fashion, and details on how to go about the task force webpage. I think we can go ahead to adjourn, and thanks everyone for attending. Please feel free to keep updated. We've got the recordings and agendas posted on our task force webpage along with that public comment process. So if there's any questions, check there, but appreciate everyone's time and thank you. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.